At this time, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Tyne Morgan. She is doing what she calls her dream job. She is a Missouri girl who has generations of agriculture rooted in her blood. Through public speaking and various contest teams, she actually plunged into broadcast at the young age of 16, working for the local radio station KMZU in Carrollton, Missouri. Tyne attended the University of Missouri at Columbus, where she majored in agricultural journalism with an emphasis in broadcast. Graduating in 2008, after spending numerous hours on the road as Ag Day and U.S. Farm Report national reporter in 2014, Tyne was named the first female host of U.S. Farm Report. She's only the fourth host of this show, following Orion Samuelson, Max Armstrong, and John Phipps. Today, Tyne continues to take a deep dive into the news and issues farmers are facing today, while also sharing stories from across rural America. She's an award-winning agriculture journalist, receiving NAFB's prestigious Doan Award twice, most recently in 2022. More important than any title she holds today is her title of mom. Tyne and her husband James are raising their two daughters in Orick, Missouri, where they are reminded daily the power of grit in a rural community as they volunteer with several organizations and work to give back. Please help me to welcome Tyne Morgan.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing this morning? Good? Everyone got some rest? Some familiar faces from last night. Well, it's an honor to be here in Lubbock and talking to this group this morning. And for all of you that watch U.S. Farm Report, I appreciate your viewership. Several of you came up this morning and said you enjoyed the show. For you that do not, I want to talk to you during the break, okay? May have to have a conversation. No, I'm joking. I love this area of Lubbock, and if you do watch the program, you see me as host of U.S. Farm Report, but actually, I do have some roots to here in Texas. My granddaddy actually farmed in Tulia, Texas, and then when my dad was in middle school, got tired of irrigating cotton in the middle of the night, which I'm sure even with technology, a lot of you can still relate today, liked the trees in Missouri and moved up Missouri, so I still have some family in Missouri, but my husband is actually from Plainview, Texas, and so I'll share a little bit of that story. This is my family here. But James grew up in Plainview, and Steve Olson I met in 2007, 2008 at Beltwide Cotton Conference when I was an intern, and just one of those people that you meet, and I just immediately fell in love with Steve, fell in love with his wife Cindy, and as we all know, for anyone that knows Steve, Cindy is definitely the better half. Right? We can all relate. So he reached out, was kept in contact, and ultimately, Steve is the one that actually introduced me to my husband. And Steve had told me, he said, Tyne, there are going to be some days that you absolutely despise me and curse my name. And now I know exactly what he was talking about. Because when I get mad at James, I get mad at Steve Olson too. So there is a direct correlation. But as host of U.S. Farm Report, started in 2012 as reporter, on the road quite a bit as reporter, and took over as host. And I'll talk about that transition here in just a minute. But last year, kind of after numerous weeks on the road, kind of almost have PTSD. I was telling Steve from traveling so much last year. I decided, you know what? It's probably time to be home. And that reminder was, I travel, and I've always traveled since the girls were born. And when we lived in northern Indiana, James did a wonderful job. He didn't complain too much about my travel, but he reminded me he didn't sign up to be a single dad, and I completely agree with that. So we moved back home for a little bit more help. But last year, my husband started traveling a little bit more, and so my oldest was walking around with a picture of her dad, and she had alligator tears. I mean, just crying. And I said, Kinsler, by the way, named after Ian Kinsler, which you Texans, if any Rangers fans in here can relate, have Kinsler. James is a baseball fan. So I said, Kinsler, what is wrong? And she just was crying, and she said, Mom, I miss my dad. And I'm thinking in my head, what in the world is going on? I know you miss your dad, but seriously walking around with this picture? And then she goes, but Mom, everybody loves my dad. And they only love you because they love my dad. And I thought, what type of brainwashing is going on while I'm on the road? It is time for me to be home a little bit more. So he travels a little bit more. I've been trying to travel a little bit less. But I picked him up from school the other day, which has been awesome. Never thought that I'd be able to, pick up the girls from school. And if there's one good thing that did come out of COVID is some of the flexibility that can happen now, right? You can work from anywhere. So pick the girls up from school. We're heading home, and they are 7 and 8, first and second grade. I love the age, but I say that about every age. I really do love this age. So we're in the car, and they said, Mom, Josie and Tiffany in our class, they just got phones. When are we going to get a cell phone? And I thought I had at least 5 more years before we had this conversation. And I said, girls, you are 7 and 8. You do not need a cell phone. And they said, well, when can we get a cell phone? I said, you can get a cell phone when you get a job, right? Practical parenting here. And the youngest quickly, she is quick-witted. She looks like her dad, she acts just like me, and I am scared to know what the teenage years are going to bring. So she quickly just says, well, Mom, I have a job. And I said, you do? What do you do for a living? She goes, I sell my teeth for a living. I said, Kimbrel, the tooth fairy is not your employer. You're going to have to learn that right now. And number 2, you do not have enough money in that piggy bank to pay for a phone. So I thought I had several years. Any of you parents that have been through this conversation before, if you can go ahead, because I really thought I had more time, but apparently I do not. So this, my husband James, which I said grew up in Plainview, he misses this area, and I can tell you he misses this area dearly. He misses a lot. There's some things now, food-wise and drink-wise, we can get in Missouri, so it's a little bit better. But he ropes all the time. He has this roping dummy in his office, and I swear he has a little bit of ADHD, because I'll be walking by and he's on the phone on his AirPods and roping this dummy in his office, and I'm like, this is not normal. Maybe this is normal for here, but it is not normal. So the other day, we had noticed that outside there was something getting the cat food that we have for the barn cat. And we couldn't figure it out. And then on the Ring camera, I saw that there were several varmints that were getting into the cat food. So I look outside one day, and this is James. A possum had been eating the cat food, and any normal person would capture it in another way. Nope, he ropes the thing because it was playing dead. So I take a picture, I put this on my Instagram, and I said, this is the reality when you live in Missouri. This is what being a cowboy looks like. So I just want you to know, even though we've transplanted to Missouri, apparently he ropes things like possums now instead of cattle, but those good life skills are still paying off. Well, as host of U.S. Farm Report, I transitioned to that role in 2014. So if you were watching the show, it probably looked like to you that a week after I got back from my first maternity leave, I took over as host of U.S. Farm Report. But as we all know, sometimes behind the scenes, that transition is in the works for quite a while. So in 2013, John Phipps, host of U.S. Farm Report, and for any of you that watch the program, you probably do not agree with everything he says. And I don't agree with everything he says, I can tell you that right now. But he does a good job of just really looking at it an alternative view, right? I don't want you to tune into the show and it just be an echo chamber of what you already are seeing or hearing or talking about with other farmers in your area. He really does a good job of providing that alternative view, even though we don't always agree. So in 2013, he made the decisions that he wanted to semi-retire. He was traveling 3.5 hours one way from his farm in Illinois to host the show. And at the time, I was in South Bend, Indiana. That's where our studios were. And he decided he wanted to step down. Now, when you think about this was in 2013, 10 years ago. At that point, a lot of things had changed in 10 years' time. But at that point, some of the executives on our team didn't know if it would be a good idea for a young female to take over the show. And rightfully so. I mean, you look at, Martin read the hosts before me. You have Max Armstrong, Orion Samuelson, and John Phipps. So obviously, I do not fit that mold that had been U.S. Farm Report since it started on the air in 1975. But John was adamant. I'd already been writing the show, had already been doing some of that behind the scenes. And so the transition was I would start hosting the show once a month while over the next year while we transitioned, and then I would take over as host. Well, about 3 months into that plan, I learned that I was pregnant. And so I immediately thought, there is no way that they think I'm going to be able to take over the show. A new mom, taking over as host, like this isn't going to happen. Well, they were elated, and we just moved that timeline back about 3 weeks. And so while John Phipps, what you see on the screen may be something that is kind of providing that alternative view, what I will tell you about this man is he is the reason that I took over as host of U.S. Farm Report. He lobbied so hard for me. He was the one that pushed to make that happen and really saw that he thought it would be a good thing. And so he's the one really that I credit for allowing me to take over as host. And when I did, I thought, there's no way I'm going to be John Phipps. I mean, he is an engineer by trade. His brain works differently than anyone else I know. But I quickly learned that I'm not going to fill his shoes. I just have to find different shoes and a different view to bring to the program. And so that's what I decided that I would do. As an ag journalist, as a host of U.S. Farm Report, I try to be more of a host and an ag journalist than I do a commentator. And if you talk to my husband, he will tell you I am a very opinionated person. I just hope that when you tune into the show, you don't know what my opinion is on every single topic, or any topic for that matter. Because you look at journalists today, that is really, we try to be middle of the road. We try to just state the facts. And I don't want you to know what side of the aisle I may be on any given issue on any given day. Because as an ag journalist, my job is to report the facts, not my opinion. And so that's kind of what's driven the show, and what I really is the motivation for what I do every day. I love being out and seeing people. Yesterday we were covering the drought conditions here, and that'll be on the show tomorrow on Ag Day and U.S. Farm Report this weekend. But as we look at kind of the biggies and what everyone's watching right now, well, the first one definitely is this. When you look at planted acres in the U.S. and you look at the prospective plantings report that's coming out from USDA on Friday. So this is the graph that they had at USDA's Ag Outlook Forum. And so this is, Friday will be our first official look at acres from a survey perspective. But this is what USDA initially thought in February at the Ag Outlook Forum that we would see. A little increase that we have in corn acres, soybean acres stay steady, an increase in wheat acres as well. And I'll get into cotton here in a second. But every kind of survey that's come out from some of these firms right now are similar. Everyone thinks that we'll see more corn acres, despite input prices. We'll see more corn acres this year. Soybean acres will hold steady, and then wheat acres, of course, as we saw, the record amount of wheat that was planted this year. Now, harvested acres, that'll be different. But when you look at plantings, that's kind of their outlook and what they're expecting for Friday. But what could be a bit of a surprise, as we know, and talking to all of you, by show of hands, how many of you right now are still undecided on exactly what you're going to plant this year? Corn, soybeans, sorghum. Show of hands. Yeah, quite a few of you guys. And I don't blame you, right? So much could change between now and you have a little bit of time to decide what you're going to plant. I was in Canada last week, and they're in the same situation because of high input prices. There's a lot of farmers that didn't pre-book some of their inputs and some of their seed, and it's going to be kind of a last-minute decision on what they do. Now, they have a totally different situation. They actually had farmers at the end of the season last year got a tariff bill. So Canada had put a tariff on fertilizer coming from Russia. Well, a lot of those vessels were already on the way. And so when those vessels got there, they imposed this tariff tax. Well, ultimately, at the end of the season, farmers got a tariff tax bill then that they had to pay. And that's still kind of in flux right now, trying to figure out who's going to pay that. But can you imagine at the end of the year getting a tariff tax bill? I mean, enough bills come in and the input prices are high enough. So there's some folks that are undecided there. But when you look at cotton acres and you look at National Cotton Council's results from their survey that came out in February, we're looking at lower cotton acres this year. And if you look at prices, I don't have to tell any of you, except for yesterday. Apparently, I need to interview Dr. Darren Hudson a little bit more on why cotton prices have not got the memo about fundamentals, because cotton prices were limit up yesterday right after we did the interview and talked about fundamentals. So I'll try to come back more often, and maybe I can help cotton prices a little bit. I kid. I know it wasn't me. I'll take the credit, but I kid. So 17% lower overall, but you look at Texas, and there's so many that are undecided right now. And so Friday potentially Could we see, you look at some of these trade estimates, if USDA, if the prospective planting survey shows that cotton acres are actually down even more, we know supplies are already tight. Could that be the start of one of the fundamental, kind of the markets get the memo, and we could see a little jump in cotton prices? As we know, it's anyone's guess. If it was just fundamentals driving the markets today, it would be a lot easier to create a game plan when it comes to trading these markets, right? When you look at the funds, you look at the outside money. For example, the past couple months, there's been some large fluctuations, not just in cotton prices, but you look at the volatility and you look at the downside, risk and just the slide that we've seen in corn and soybean prices, and no one could figure out why. Well, these fund reports that we typically, get from USDA, apparently that reporting system, that report had been hacked, and so we hadn't been getting that information. And so market analysts weren't even sure why prices were going lower. Well, as soon as we got the report that showed fund positions, we knew exactly why prices went lower. And it was because of some of these outside money and some of the funds that were trading. And so I know how frustrating it is as a farmer and when, supply and demand and the simple fundamentals should be what's driving the markets. And today that's not the case. And it's not going to change. And so there's a lot of things that we can learn from last year, but there's one thing that will remain, and that is it seems like volatility will continue to be the name of the game when it comes to the markets, and it's more than just supply and demand that are driving prices. I mentioned winter wheat seedings, and we all know this, when they came out and USDA showed planted acres in their report in January, it was a big surprise to some. But for you guys, probably wasn't much of a surprise. Had a little bit of rain on some of those failed out cotton acres, a lot more wheat went in. You look at some of those areas. I mean, I have a neighbor in Missouri that's growing wheat for the first time in 14 years. And in Missouri, a lot of times wheat is used as a cover that's never taken to harvest, but they're actually going to harvest wheat acres. Same case in Illinois, talking to some of those farmers. So there was more acres that were planted. But as we all know, you step out your back door and planted acres and harvested acres are a completely different story. And so as we look at some of, the situation that's happening, there was a lot of uncertainty last year when Russia invaded Ukraine, thinking that there would be no flow of grain that came out. But the reality was we still saw a record amount of wheat exported in the Black Sea region. And you question, how in the heck can that even happen? Well, last week, I saw on Twitter, which, Twitter, there's a lot of things that frustrate me about that. And I know sometimes you just have to put the phone down and take a break. But I'm telling you, you can see some great things in across the country. And Quentin, I see you over there. Quentin, a couple weeks ago, or I guess it was 6 weeks ago when that dust storm came through, I interviewed him and he had some great photos. So it really is a great resource. You've got to sift through some of it. But there was a vessel that was leaving, that was kind of in that Black Sea corridor. And it was a Russian vessel, and apparently it was full of stolen wheat from Ukraine. And I thought, I called an analyst. I said, how can you confirm? Like, is this real? How can you confirm that this is stolen wheat from Ukraine? Apparently they have satellites that are tracking that. So there's a record number of exports out of the Black Sea region, and somehow Russia has even more exports coming out of their area. And in many cases, it is stolen wheat. And so just as you see from a year ago what we thought would not get out of that Black Sea region, and today how much has been exported, right or wrong, that situation was, it definitely at first, a lot of the funds, that's why we saw prices go up and maybe overdone to some extent. But it was because of the fear that we would not see some of the exports come out of those areas. We saw wheat prices go up, and we saw plantings happen where wheat hadn't been planted in more than a decade. But as I said, it will be interesting as we start getting more of these winter wheat condition reports and kind of the reality sets in that the U.S. crop here in some of these key wheat areas is not as good as what some may think. And I go back to this January report because I know there's not a lot of corn grown in this area. But this, I think, shows, it confirmed what a lot of you guys already knew. So in January, the final report from USDA came out, and there were a couple bullish factors that came out of that. And one of those was the fact that we saw a big drop in harvested corn acres. And so everybody was asking, where did the 1.6 million acres of corn, where did it go? Well, you look at this map, and you know exactly where it went. Overlay that with the drought monitor, And there were areas, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, that we knew some of that corn couldn't even be harvested. In some areas of Kansas, I heard the aflatoxin was so bad that EPA was making them get rid of it completely because they wanted to make sure that it didn't get in the supply. And so now, as you look at some of these areas, and yes, maybe we had a decent crop in Illinois and Indiana, but we are seeing, as we know, a lot of that grain flow from the eastern corn belt over to the western area and the plains. And an analyst on the show last weekend had said, I think if you look at it, there may be actually more old crop corn right now in the western corn belt than in the east, just because so much has been purchased due to all of the transportation and the rail issues that we saw last year. And so the situation, as we look at it, supplies are still tight. And as you look at kind of the drought picture, I promise you I'm just going to show this map once, because I know you do not need to be reminded of the reality of what you guys are looking at today. But you look at how far up the drought is parked in the U.S. right now. We've seen in California, one extreme to the other, right? Drought pretty much gone in the central portion of California. But you look at the drought situation, and it's not like things are perfect in all corn growing states this year. And even in some cases, we're looking at flood risks. So this is California. Talking about another atmospheric river that's heading into some of that area. Dairy producers are trying to get their cattle to higher ground. A lot of that area is for produce. So a lot of strawberries, lettuce in some of that area. And so it's not like it's covering the whole region, but where the flooding is happening, they just flooded in January, and it was before a lot of things were planted, like the lettuce and strawberries. And here you are about 6 weeks later, and they're dealing with it again. And the crops had been planted at that time. And so it's a reminder of how quickly things can change. But one thing that we're not really talking about a lot right now, we've been talking about the drought a lot. We've been talking about, how wet some of these areas are and the snowpack in North Dakota and South Dakota. I mean, I think it's either the third or the fourth longest streak that they've had below 40 degrees in Fargo, North Dakota. And you look at some of these pictures. There was a guy that posted a picture where he was going out to grill, and there's this mound of snow. They have so much snow, every single week a system keeps coming through. So you look at North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, all of these areas have been hammered by snowfall this year. And it's a good thing, and as far as, replenishing some of the soil moisture profiles that maybe weren't great out of last year in some of those dry areas. But at the same time, now we're looking at flooding risks. And NOAA just recently last week put out their outlook, and there's an elevated flooding risk in the Mississippi River area of Wisconsin, Minnesota, some areas of Iowa. And right now, it may be too early to talk about, prevent plant and possibly some of those acres not getting planted in South Dakota, North Dakota, and some of those areas in the Mississippi River Valley. But you have a couple more weeks, and you have more of these systems come on board, and you have more flooding risk. I mean, the Mississippi River was at record low levels just how many months ago? 6 months ago? If you saw some of those videos, they were finding, ships and different things. You could walk across the Mississippi River in the Delta. Absolutely crazy how low that river was. And now we're talking about flooding. And so those are one of those factors that this spring, if it's too early to talk about prevent plant in some of those areas at this time. But if those systems keep coming, if this pattern continues, and we continue to see moisture as we head into spring planting season, that could actually take away some acres from the big acreage, the overall acreage picture, at a time where we really can't afford to lose any acres. And so those are one of those things that, they're starting to be whispers of prevent plant. Like I said, it's too early. Just like here, there are, some weeks that they're hoping that the rain may shut off for a bit, where you guys are hoping that the rain actually turns on. But there are a few more weeks before we really get into this prevent plant discussion, and could we possibly see some of these acres disappear this year just because of how wet things are. And so that's one of those things that analysts are saying that could be one of those factors that fuels a spring possible rally in some of these markets. And if that's the case, a lot of analysts are saying take advantage of it. Because they just don't think, when you look at the past few years, and you look at 10 years really, and you look at kind of the cyclical of the market, it's rare that you would see weather really fuel in the summer months for a third year in a row. But you look at the demand scenario, and talking to any of you, we all know how important China can be for demand, right? Especially for cotton. But this year, China's population drop that came out, it was a bit of a surprise to some folks. And really, when I talked to market analysts, they said, this kind of confirms what we thought. And as we all know, I don't have to tell any of you, it's hard to know of what is reality in China, right? They'll say one thing, but do another. And you have to watch what China does, not what they say. And so when you look at the population drop in China, and we knew this was happening, and we knew that there could be a risk. Now, they blamed COVID. As we all know, it was not just COVID. There's a lot of policies that have been over there that has changed their population. But when you look at the population drop, there have been concerns about what will this mean for overall export demand. Are we going to end up exporting fewer commodities to China just because of the simple, economics of not having the population that they once did? And are they going to be this powerhouse? And as we know right now, the relationships between the US and China are not great at all. Things continue to be elevated. It's every week something gets said. But what USDA thinks, and this was in the Ag Outlook Forum in January, they think that no matter where this relationship goes, that China will continue to be a top export market for US ag commodities. You look at soybeans, you look at corn, you look at dairy and some of the whey protein that heads to China, that no matter what happens. And as frustrating as China is, we know we need China for some of these exports for now. It's not like you can take China out of the picture and completely just reshuffle the whole demand picture and somebody else make up for that lost demand. At this point in time, you really need that balance, and you really still need China in the picture. And so USDA right now thinks that we will see a bit of a decline, but China will be the top ag export market. But you look at some of the supply chain issues that we had, and these were headlines from a year ago. You look at some of these supply chain issues, and a lot of them dealt with China. When you look at, they weren't open back up completely from COVID. You didn't have all of the factories that were open. We were having port issues, containers, hearing about produce and meat that was rotting at the port because they didn't have enough plug-ins to plug in these refrigerated containers. I mean, there were so many challenges with China. Well, it doesn't seem like it's going to go away. So a couple weeks ago, I was talking to Sam Taylor with Rabobank, and he's their ag inputs analyst, and he just really follows just the ag inputs market. And we talked about things like fertilizer prices, where, our fertilizer prices in some areas, the wholesale price has dropped significantly in some areas, but it hasn't always trickled down to the farmer. And why is there so much disparity from one retail location to the next retail location? And he kind of simplified it as, well, he said, it's like trying to catch a falling knife. No one wants to be on the wrong end of that, right? And fertilizer prices had fallen so quickly, so fast, that some that had kind of pre-booked some of these input prices, for these smaller retail locations, they're not able to absorb a 30% drop in prices like some of the bigger retailers. And so you have some of these mom and pop ag retail locations that maybe aren't able to pass on, the drop that you've seen and be competitive with some of these bigger retail locations. And that's just reality. And that's why we're seeing some of this disparity. But I just talked about the flooding that was happening, could happen in the upper Midwest. I mean, there's the little spring field work that has gone on in that upper Corn Belt. I was in southern Missouri last week. They're like 95% done with putting on anhydrous, getting fields prepped. I mean, they're ready to go. You go 2 hours north, and that's more like 3% of the field work has been done. And so you look at that delay, and if we're not able to utilize some of these inputs in the fertilizer that we have on the books, that will then go back into the overall availability of the market, and we could see more downside pressure on fertilizer prices. So that's another factor. But the other factor is, when you look at herbicide prices, is China. So as we all know, we were reminded a couple years ago and last year that whether it's glyphosate, glufosinate, whatever the herbicide may be, that we are reliant upon the active ingredients that come out of China. I mean, and how many of you had actually stepped back to think about, okay, really, where do all of these ingredients come from, right? I mean, I hadn't really stepped back, but that was one thing that we had to learn, where you didn't realize that some of these products were coming from some of these other areas. Well, China's one where they have that's where a lot of the active ingredients come. And Sam told me that in October, they had always subscribed to a report that would give them an idea of not only, active ingredients, supplies, and prices and all of that. And this is Rabobank, right? A company that has offices around the world. Well, China has now quit, even though it was a paid subscription, they have quit releasing that report because they viewed it as giving places like the US a competitive advantage. And so now as you look in the industry, and unless you have kind of this private connection and really know exactly, where supply is set, where price is set, the flow of information out of China in some cases is now non-existent. Same cases with some of those reports that were coming out of China. Offices that shut down, some of these private groups that then China shut down some of these offices. So the flow of information out of China has become worse. And as we think about, we already thought that it was kind of, it was deceiving and some of the things that they said weren't true, but at least there were some sources that you could rely on. Those are becoming fewer and fewer. And so the reason I bring that up is with the lack of transparency out of there, even more so now, it is going to be even harder to really keep a pulse on where things are going and kind of the future of where price is set and really be able to track some of these input prices, not only the availability, but where prices are heading. And that could only get worse because of the lack of information. And there is a whole effort to try to get a lot of these inputs developed here in the US. But there's a reason that a lot of these manufacturers are overseas, at places where energy may be a little bit cheaper and they don't have the regulations that they have in the US. So there is an effort, but as we all know, it definitely takes time. But one area that agriculture thinks maybe they can, we can reduce our reliance upon China is the area of renewable diesel. And it's kind of, we've been talking about it for, I would say, a year and a half, 2 years now, on renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, what it means in this whole new era. I don't know about any of you, but when I get on an airplane, an electric car, that's one thing. I don't have one. I can't keep my phone charged. I know I'm not going to be able to keep my car charged. So I don't think an electric vehicle is for me, to be honest. My husband will tell you that. Nor am I going to stop for an hour for that to get charged. I don't want to stop 5 minutes to fill up with gas, right? Like that's just how I work. But when you look at sustainable aviation fuel, how many of you are wanting to test out an electric airplane? I can tell you I'm not going to be the first run at it. I can promise you that. And so when you look at some of these sources, as you have these climate goals and everything now that are set forth, could renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, could that be an area where actually we reduce the reliance upon China? Some think renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, all of this, that this could be as big for soybeans and corn and some of these other crops that ethanol was for corn back when ethanol came on board. And I know there's a lot of different opinions about the ethanol mandate and what all of that means. But renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, there could be an opportunity there. And this is a chart from S&P Global Platts that we just had on the show, I think a couple weeks ago. Pete Meyer, who's out of New York, he has conversations with all of these oil companies a lot. And so he's really good at keeping a pulse on where things are going. And as you can see right now, when you look at these carbon intensity scores and everything that people are looking at, right now, soybean oil is still the majority of what could fuel this market. But there's a lot of other crops that are coming on board. And right now, when you look at crush capacity and some of these facilities that are either coming online or expanding, I think there's more than 20 projects in the works right now. The first of which, a Marathon plant in Martinez, California, that actually is coming online this month. That plant actually is running on used cooking oil. So you look at used cooking oil, and that's what that plant is using. And come to find out, we don't produce enough used cooking oil in the US. And so they're getting a lot of that used cooking oil from where else? But China. Who would have thought? And so you look at cooking oil and some of these, that it could fuel some of these plants. But we're also seeing now big oil and big ag team up. And who would have thought this would happen 10 years ago? I mean, we know with ethanol groups and big oil, they were definitely on opposite ends of the spectrum when it came to ethanol. But now we're seeing these groups team up. So whether that's Bunge, Chevron teaming up with Corteva for a new canola variety that'll be grown as a cover crop. S&W Seeds, which I saw an S&W Seeds facility when I was heading out to our shoot yesterday. S&W Seeds teamed up with, I think it is Shell Oil, I believe, and they are growing camelina coming up with a camelina variety that can be used as a cover crop and harvested, as well as a new company called Covercress, which has pennycress, which typically, pennycress is a winter weed, but they have then bred that now to be a valuable cover crop that you can harvest and crush for renewable diesel. Pennycress this year, they said, is grown on 10,000 acres. There's 10,000 acres planted this year alone. In 5 years, they want to grow that to 20 million acres. So you look at this opportunity, and we look at cover crops here, and I know cover crops need rain too, and I know this year there was some frustration with some of those cover crops even that you guys were going to take to harvest as possibly would be a valuable feed source for cattle in the area. But what if you could go grow a cover crop that not only met some of the climate goals, but you could actually harvest it and have a second stream of income in the winter? How amazing would that be? And so you look at some of these challenges that you may face with some of the climate goals and some of these that come down the pipeline, but you look at something like renewable diesel and coming up with a way of making what traditionally is a weed in the winter into a valuable cover crop that can fuel the renewable diesel space. It's interesting to see where this will go over the next 5 years, the next 10 years. But when you have big oil and big ag teaming up for the first time, I can guarantee you one thing: none of those companies want to see this fail. And so there could be some investment, there could be some incentives to get more of these acres to fuel, because as right now, we don't even have enough soybean acres. One analyst says we'll need 15 million more acres of soybeans grown in the U.S. in order to meet renewable diesel demand. Is that going to happen? I don't know. But there could be some of these cover crops then that could be grown in the winter months and help fuel it as well. Now, farmland prices, these are just some from the Midwest. Listen, I know some of these prices have nothing on some of these prices in Texas. We are well aware of that. But when you look at farmland prices and what we saw last year, you know, when you, and cash rent specifically, and then some of these farmland sales, that's only adding to the cost that you guys are seeing on your operation. And some of these sales, $27,000 per acre, $26,000 per acre, you wonder, how does that pencil? It doesn't, right? It doesn't. But as long as the demand is there, a couple years ago, whenever we started to see the farmland values really skyrocket in some of these areas, it was 50% farmers, 50% investors that were at these auctions that ended up being kind of the winning bidder. It was 50-50. Last year, that transitioned to 75% farmers, 25% investors. And I say that with a caveat, because at these auctions, you do have some of these investor groups that are also there that are driving up the cost that these 75% of farmers ended up actually paying. And so when you look at it, it all plays together. But at this point, last year, overall for sales, it was still farmers that were in the driver's seat as far as most of these farmland buys. This year, with interest rates, that could change, and we've seen some slow. It doesn't mean like that you're not going to see some of these one-off sales happen. But you look at the availability of farmland, and owning farmland is actually cool again. All of you that know farmland, right? That's always been the American dream for you. But when I hear stories of lawyers and doctors in Kansas City that all of their friends own farmland, and so they've reached out in our area to try to find farmland because they want to be in the cool kids club and own farmland too, that's when you become concerned about how cool is farmland and what price are they willing to pay. But farmland is extremely popular. We all know the value in owning farmland and that being the American dream. But there seems like there's a lot of other people jumping on board and wanting to own farmland as well. And so as we look at the future of farmland prices, when I talk to all of the experts and what they think this year we will see farmland values cool a little bit. But if we continue to see some of those key crops, and at least some profits in some of those areas, that we will continue to see some support for farmland prices. And I bring this up because I did a story on cash rent auctions. It was several weeks ago, and this is a piece of ground in Illinois that went for over $600 per acre cash rent. And first question you ask is how does that pencil? And again, I'm going to say the same thing I did before. It doesn't. But you look at this $620 per acre. The previous rent the year before, $280 per acre. And so this was done on a cash rent auction. It's a new concept. Not a lot of folks are using it yet, thankfully. But you look at what these cash rent auction, and basically it's just doing what you do for farmland auctions. Instead of this, one deal that you have with a landlord, they then open it up. There can be stipulations like we want, there actually is like we want these practices done on this ground. A lot of times it's actually it's not the highest bidder that wins. They actually want it to go to a young producer. So there are some advantages. But when it's solely based on price, you are seeing farmland prices skyrocket. And this is a one-off. But in general, they said when it goes to a cash rent auction, you're seeing cash rents go up 130% in the Eastern Corn Belt. And so the record cash rent prices are happening in Illinois. The record farmland prices are happening in Iowa. And this is just a glimpse of what possibly could be coming to an area when you open it up and now have cash rents on an auction basis. So one of those things that's scary. You don't know what's going to happen. Will it last? Who knows? But we are starting to see this gain traction in some area. And I know you guys are going to go through policy, and so I'm going to skip through a lot of this because I know you guys will cover it. But as you look at the Farm Bill, and I know here, when you look at Title I of the Farm Bill and the importance of, really having a safety net, you want Title I, you want crop insurance, you don't want to, mess with the reference price. It's all of those that is being heard loud and clearly, especially from that House Ag Committee. And Martin, you mentioned that letter that came out, and Jim Wiesmeyer, a Farm Journal Washington correspondent, he said that was the best letter that he's ever seen come out of the House Ag Committee or any Ag Committee ahead of a Farm Bill, because it was obvious that they understood specifically for agriculture what needed to change and what needed to be left alone, and really, reiterating that we would not need to see a record amount of ad hoc disaster aid payments every year if we had a safety net that was truly a safety net. And although that's a message that I've heard from a lot of growers here in Texas, and it's not just weather events, it's not just drought, it's not just some of those disaster aid, it's other things too, that message of we need to see a more adequate safety net. But you look at the pie right now, and you look at the budget, and the talk was that really there would not be more budget available for things like expanding, Title I and seeing a better safety net. But that letter that came out of the House Ag Committee, that actually the tune was a little bit different, and it showed that they understood that there could be ways to strengthen Title I of the Farm Bill without taking a lot of money from other places. But at the end of the day, I asked Jim Wiesmeyer. I think Jim Wiesmeyer maybe has spoken to groups down here before. Like I said, he's our Farm Journal Washington correspondent. I tell people, I love Jim Wiesmeyer. I've learned you have to surround yourself with good people. And talking to Jim Wiesmeyer is like going to the hair salon, but a lot of times it involves more alcohol. That's the only difference. But if your hair salon serves alcohol, maybe I should check that out and see, because maybe we could bring that to Missouri. But I said, Jim, what are 3 things that these cotton producers here in Texas need to know? I sent him a message on Sunday, and he said, here are the 3 biggies. Don't get bogged down in the parlor game of if or when there will be a farm bill. So the timing, right? And this year, that's everybody's question. Are we going to see a farm bill this year? Jim said, quit asking that question, because don't get bogged down in that right now. And he said, what if it doesn't happen this year? Okay, and we pass it to next year. So don't get bogged down in the timeline. Food stamp funding and any worker requirements viewed at, the way he explained it is that is a key item. And when I talked to him last year about it, he had said, Tyne, this is how we're going to get a farm bill done. As long as Republicans don't mess with the food portion of it and the food stamps portion of it, and as long as Democrats don't mess with the ag portion of it, right? And we're not going to be able to take away from either. And as long as we have some agreement there, and the food stamps being a biggie, that we'll see a farm bill. And so there's still some questions about that. But he also said major row crops will eventually see the crop insurance program change for several reasons. And as you can see those reasons up there, to make the program more appealing to crops and livestock, and via more funding for crop insurance to deal. So those were the biggies from Jim. I wanted to make sure to get his thoughts. I know we'll have more policy talk here in a bit, and the Farm Bill is a big discussion right now and what's going to happen. But a lot of it also deals with climate smart agriculture. When you look at conservation, you look at carbon programs, you look at some of these climate smart ag programs, how much of that is going to be implemented in the Farm Bill. And regenerative ag, and this is a term that, I started hearing a little bit last year. I'd heard it here or there. But earlier this year, in January, the World Economic Forum had their big meeting, their global meeting. And on the homepage of the World Economic Forum, this was the story: 5 benefits of regenerative agriculture and 5 ways to scale it. And so I'd kind of heard about it, but you look at the World Economic Forum that is specifically talking about it, the benefits, and where we could see agriculture go. And you think about regenerative ag, and there's going to be some mindset changes, because with regenerative ag, one thing that is essential is tillage. So tillage is actually, tilling your farm isn't that curse word that no one's supposed to say. Tillage is actually a tool when it comes to regenerative ag. So there's some of these conversations as we see the pendulum swing from one extreme to the other, and we hear about these possible climate smart programs, and we look at how things could change or what programs could come across. Look at regenerative ag, because that is the new buzzword that really is taking hold. And like I said, when you see the World Economic Forum, and that's on their homepage of their website during their annual meeting, it definitely took me back a little bit. But climate smart, as we know, and USDA still continues to say that it will be voluntary. And when you look at programs that work here, we know they do not work in Iowa or Illinois. You look at cover crops, they're wonderful. And for those that got planted this year and didn't get burned up and with the dust storm that came in, static electricity didn't get it, it's great to still have that cover on. But again, cover crops need water to grow too. And so there's a lot of these programs that you look at the Climate Smart Ag, $3 billion that USDA will be giving out through different programs. And there's different commodity organizations that are part of those that are actually ground truthing and trying to find some of that data behind, okay, this works in it or this doesn't. Don't have a blanket approach that says, oh, you've got to reduce your footprint by this much. You've got to reduce your fertilizer use by this much. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. No, let's ground truth some of these things to see if it does move the needle or if it doesn't. When you look at some of these practices, we have to be open to some change. But as long as change actually moves our operation forward and doesn't actually take away from some of the production and some of the practices that you guys know are true and really work here in Texas. And one thing I do on this Climate Smart, one thing I do want to end on is in January, I had the chance to sit down with John Deere's Chief Technology Officer at CES, the Consumer's Electronics Show. And when you look at CES, typically, these are for the tech nerds, and I do not mean that in a bad way for any tech nerds that are in this room. But these are people from all over the world that just want to hear about the latest technology. And for the first time ever, agriculture was part of the keynote address. And when John Deere was on stage in front of all these attendees from all across the world, talking about their booth and just where we see agriculture going and how important technology will be, and John Deere said, there are actually farmers in the room, the whole audience gasped. Like it was celebrities that were in the room and they were so excited. And that's exactly what I saw over the next couple days while I was there. But I had the chance to sit down and talk with Deere's Chief Technology Officer about things like, okay, are we going to see electric tractors? Looking at automation, and then I'll boil it down real quick. The moral of the story, and when I talk to Case IH, I talk to all of these companies, is automation is already here and it is coming, but it will not be across the board for everything. When you look at some of this larger equipment, it's not like everything you will have to purchase will be automated. But as we know, with labor issues, we could see more automation. And again, as we all know, especially here in cotton country, it does come at a cost, right? Everything comes at a cost, and we will see more automation. But electric tractors, there was a social media post that had gone around last year saying that Deere was pushing all electric tractors, and that's where this was going. And so I asked that question. I sat down with him, and I'm telling you, this is one of the most candid individuals, and actually a farmer friend, a Texas farmer from Itasca, Texas, he had told me, he said, this Jamie Heineman had come out to his farm, and he said, Tyne, I didn't even know that was the Chief Technology Officer. I thought it was another guy, because this guy was so down to earth. So I asked Jim, we just had a conversation. I said, are we moving to all electric tractors? Is that where we're going? And he said, I talked about the 8R numbers, and this was at CES, and when I ran the numbers on it, if you power that with a lithium-ion battery today, it's twice the volume, twice the weight, twice the mass, and 4 times the cost. It doesn't pencil. And so at the end of the day, when you look, maybe some of these smaller equipment may go to electric, and we've seen it happen in like the construction space, and that's moved to more electric. He said right now, when you look at bigger equipment, it actually makes a bigger footprint. It doesn't make your footprint any less. And so, it was nice to hear that logic is actually still at the forefront of some of these conversations. And as we see and we hear these climate goals and we hear where things are going, at the end of the day for agriculture, it has to work, right? It actually has to work. And thankfully, because of data and everything that we have at our fingertips, we will be able to show what works and what doesn't and have the data and the metrics to back it up. But the one thing that I learned, and what I'll end with, is when I went to CES, everything you hear about how all of these consumers view agriculture and farmers as the villains, right? They're the problem. And you look at the, carbon emissions and livestock farmers, oh, that's the problem. That's the headlines that you read. That's what you hear. But that is not what I heard at CES. These individuals from all across the world that were at these tech companies, they could not wait to talk to farmers. I mean, farmers were the celebrity. And so what I quickly learned is, even though we hear these things about how, agriculture isn't viewed positively, it's actually the opposite. When consumers can actually connect with farmers and share that story and get on the same level of talking in tech talk, talking about what agriculture is doing and what farmers are doing, you would be amazed at how that moves the needle. And so all these folks that say, well, because we're so many generations removed from the farm, no one knows what agriculture does, it's doom and gloom. After attending CES, I do not see it that way, not whatsoever. Because once we can figure out how to talk to the different consumer segments and really what correlates and what connects to those consumers, you'd be amazed at how their view of farmers change. And so when I look at, kind of where we're going and where agriculture is heading, and I look at farmers in this very room, and I interviewed several farmers yesterday talking about the drought situation. There is one theme that truly does resonate, and that is resilience reigns. I know it's challenging. I hear from all of you. I know sometimes you have to shut off the TV, you have to close your door, and you just want to break from it all. But resilience really does reign. And so you'll continue to plant your future, harvest your past, and you will continue to make cotton the breadbasket of this area and the backbone of this area like it's always been, because you're willing to adapt, you're willing to evolve, and that's really what makes you guys some of the best farmers in the U.S., and I truly do mean that. I've met a lot, and you guys really are some of the most salt of the earth, willing to change, willing to adapt, and just resilient. So it's an honor to be with you guys today. Thank you so much for letting me speak and look at the ag industry and kind of give a scope of where things are going. But I'm excited because we're going to hear a lot more over the next several minutes and today as we look at agriculture. But right now we need to take a 5